Welcome back, everybody. I hope by this point you've had a chance to see that Toastmasters video about writing and delivering great speeches. It basically serves as a kind of overview of what it is that we are going to be talking about over the course of this semester. You can see that what they did, and I've posted this in the notes as well for today's class, what they've done is that they divided speeches up into three distinct categories. The informative speech, which they argue that in particular needs to be clear and concise. The persuasive speech, which they argue that requires motivation, so oftentimes you have to appeal to emotions. And lastly, the speech that entertains, and that's a speech that you oftentimes use stories and humor. And that's very similar in some ways to the ways I've divided up our three graded speeches. I don't have an entertainment speech, but I do have an autobiographical speech, your 5-minute speech, where you get to tell the class a little bit about yourself. And I've always found that at least to be entertaining and interesting to find out about who is in the class. And I think that the class also appreciates to find out about their classmates, which you oftentimes don't get to do very well when you are in other classes. And then the informative speech is our second speech, where you're going to be teaching us something for 10 minutes or so. And our last speech is the persuasive speech, where you're going to try to convince the audience in about 15 minutes or so to take an action or to perhaps support a position. Though I've oftentimes argued that these three speech divisions are very artificial, in that basically all speeches should try to entertain and use some stories and humor when possible. That all speeches are informative. Even your first autobiographical speech will be informing us a little bit about what you think is important about your particular life. And that all speeches are persuasive in the sense that you're always trying to convince somebody of something. And in your autobiographical speech, what you're trying to persuade us of is whatever information you're sharing about yourself is that it has a good level of importance. Just like the informative speech, I think hopefully has a level of entertainment to it. And you are trying to persuade us in the informative speech that whatever you're trying to teach us has a level of importance. And finally, when you get to the persuasive speech, you are going to need to use information in order to try to persuade us. And again, whenever you can use stories or humor or be entertaining, that certainly is something that's positive. Though I've oftentimes told students that really their greatest strength in terms of public speaking is their personality. So while it's lovely to be able to use humor, I know there are some people who basically aren't very humorous. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The idea is that you use the strengths of your personality in order to be able to communicate with your audience. So, that said, the video focused on practicing. Oh, and by the way, practicing. And I can't emphasize that enough, that the more times you deliver information, the more comfortable you become with that particular information. And I'll be setting aside some practice time as well in class for those of you who wanted to utilize that. Of course, we have some additional challenges this semester, but anybody that you can practice in front of, and you saw in the video that even your pet might be an appropriate audience member to be able to practice. Anybody that you can practice in front of gives you some more experience with being able to deliver. And basically, the two things we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester are speeches first need to have an element of preparation associated with them. So this is where basically you don't get to see other people's hard work when you listen to their speech, but the hard work shows based on how polished the speech is. What we do get to see is the presentation part of the speech, and that's what most speakers focus on, is the presentation. But if you don't do proper preparation, you're not going to have good presentation. And preparation includes things like thinking about things like the logistics. In other words, where will you be presenting your speech? What are your time limits? Things like your audience, who is in your audience. And that said, you have an advantage in this class in that you know who your audience is, and it's your fellow classmates. And even if you know nothing about your fellow classmates, you do know that basically everyone is a college student, and that in and of itself is a wealth of information. And your objective. Why are you delivering this speech? And you might say, well, that's very obvious, as I'm delivering this speech to get an A, or I'm delivering this speech to satisfy a requirement. So when I think about the autobiographical speech, the objective, not only in terms of your being able to practice the skills that we talk about in class, but your objective is to try to tell the class a little bit more about who you are and what's important to you. Doing necessary research, and that probably is not something that you would need to do for the first speech, deliberately so. You probably already know what you need to know in terms of telling the class a little bit about who you are. It's just a question of you're making decisions as to what it is you want to share and how do you incorporate that within 5 minutes. But as the speeches progress, particularly by the time we get to the last speech, you will be required to use outside research and learn how to incorporate that into your arguments. And then the actual writing of the speech. And in some ways, if you've taken an English class, then you know that the construction follows a 3-part structure of an introduction, a body, or what the video called a discussion section, and then a conclusion. So that's something that you can transfer over from your English classes to your public speaking classes. The introduction is where you give your thesis, your main point, and it's also where you greet the audience. And greeting is important, as we'll talk about with introductions and conclusions, because it gives the audience an opportunity to know that you're going to begin, and it also gives you an opportunity to settle yourself so that you can start. The discussion is where you give your evidence and your details, and your conclusion is where you give your closing and your farewell. And the farewell is going to be important. This is your cue to the audience that you are finishing your speech, which again we'll talk more about in depth when we talk about introductions and conclusions. And then in terms of the presentation, and in some ways this is how it's different from English classes, you want to be conversational. So when you're writing a paper, you have a certain level of formality. But when you are presenting within the moment, you want to have a certain level of spontaneity. So you don't necessarily want to be as precise as you would be with a piece of writing, because by doing so, you probably are going to sacrifice things like eye contact and body language, all of the performance pieces that are involved. So how to do this? The best way to do it is to have a good speaking outline, which is different probably than the kind of outline that you would normally use if you were writing a paper. Because if you were writing a paper, your outline would probably be very detailed. The more detailed, the better, to give you a sense of direction with writing your paper. The exact opposite with the speaking outline, which we'll talk about in future classes when we talk about outlining. You want keywords and phrases on that outline in order to jog your memory about the points that you want to make. But you don't want to be too detailed, because again, if you're too detailed in your outline, then you need to read your outline, and that means you lose things like eye contact, body language, and vocal inflections. Things that you should vary over the course of the speech so that you can keep your audience's interest. Pausing, and I can say that that's one of my biggest challenges as well, in that I know I speak very quickly. I guess it's the New York City girl in me. And also I tend to feel this stress about making sure that I'm able to cover all of the material in the time that I have. But taking a pause oftentimes is very useful, both for the audience, so they can consider what it is that you've said, and also for the speaker, so you can get some air and gather your thoughts. And anticipating some audience questions. Sometimes you might deliver a speech and there won't be audience questions. But once we start getting into speeches like informative and persuasive speeches in particular, the audience might be engaged in asking you questions for clarification. And any way that you can prepare for that ahead of time, almost like preparing ahead of time for the questions you might receive in a job interview, is useful. So all of that was covered in the video, as well as the idea of nerves and nervousness, and that was the piece that I did not include in the notes. And one of the reasons why is because I would not have included that in the notes in class, because at this point we would do a class activity about trying to determine ways to control or reduce nervousness. And nervousness is a very common element with delivering speeches. And I believe one of the reasons why is because most of us have very little experience in delivering speeches to the public. If you're not an entertainer or you're not a teacher, you probably don't interact with the public very much, at least on a broad basis where you have multiple people listening to you at exactly the same time. So it's a question of practice, I believe, more than anything else. But In terms of nervousness, this is where I would put you all into groups and I would ask you to try to generate some ideas, either based on what you saw in the video or based on what you did in the reading, or just with your own experiences, because my suspicion is that you've all had challenges with situations that evoke nervousness in the past, and you probably have some techniques. So what I will do is make that today's attendance question on our discussion forum. What suggestions do you have to control nervousness? And I encourage you to not only share your own suggestions, but to read your classmates' suggestions as well. In fact, I encourage you to do that throughout the semester with the forum. And if you wanted to respond to any of your classmates, certainly you're free to do so. But I think of it in the same way that I would think of it as class participation, and that you can make the decision to respond to somebody else or not. But I do think it's a good idea to listen or to read what everybody else has said, because that only is another avenue for learning for you and for the class as a whole. So again, I'll repeat the attendance question at the ending of this video, because then I thought what I would do is that I would proceed and talk a little bit about the 3 chapters that I had assigned for reading at this point. And I'm aware that you may not necessarily have had an opportunity to get a hold of a textbook, though I'm hopeful that you will be able to do so soon. And the first chapter, entitled Speech in Higher Ed, talks a little bit about why it's important to study public speaking. In fact, I dare say that it's trying to persuade the reader that public speaking is important. And what the first chapter, and all of the chapters do as well, is that they introduce some vocabulary, some language associated with communication and with public speaking. So some of these terms might be terms that you have an understanding of, but you just didn't necessarily realize that they had a specific name associated with this idea. And perhaps that's the case with chapter number 1, when they talk about the 3 reasons why it's important to study public speaking. They talk about an intellectual imperative, a social imperative, and a consumer imperative. And perhaps the names can give you an idea of what they might mean. Intellectual imperative, the idea of being an intellectual being or being well educated. In other words, just to make sure that you've got a knowledge base with foundation disciplines: math, science, communication, public speaking. So if you've wondered, one of the reasons as to why public speaking is a requirement for a liberal arts degree is because that discipline, along with many other disciplines, are thought to be essential in terms of being a well-educated individual. The second is the social imperative. In other words, that we as human beings engage in human interaction. And no way, shape, or form related just to school, but all of our daily interactions require communication with other people. Sometimes with individuals, sometimes with small groups, sometimes with large groups. So just in terms of being able to interact on a daily basis, that's one of the reasons why public speaking is so important. So this is a skill that you can definitely utilize in your life, probably daily. And then lastly, the consumer imperative, that we as consumers of speeches, we as audience members, need to be able to evaluate speeches. And that I think has become increasingly important in our political world. The idea that we oftentimes are exposed to speeches that don't necessarily follow the same criteria that we ourselves are encouraged to follow as speakers. In other words, being clear and being organized and being ethical. And I would suggest that we as audience members should request more when we're confronted with that in the political arena or in the social arena or any other arenas. That if we have to maintain these standards, we should expect these standards from other public speakers, and that we should hold them accountable if they aren't following these particular standards. So the intellectual imperative, the social imperative, and the consumer imperative are all reasons why it's important to study public speaking. And I had mentioned the idea of ethics or credibility. There's a word for that. It's called ethos, which sounds a lot like ethics. And that we want to hold ourselves accountable to being ethical and credible when we present information. And we want to hold other people accountable when they are presenting information as well. And I've oftentimes said that public speaking is a difficult class to teach, in the sense that while We in class talk about being ethical. We go home and turn on the television set and we see perhaps speeches delivered where they aren't necessarily doing that. And these individuals are rewarded with privilege and with power and with money. And my response is that we should hold these individuals accountable, that if we have to suffer repercussions in terms of grades for not doing this, they too should have to suffer negative repercussions in relation to their careers for not doing that. And I think the last piece I wanted to talk about with chapter 1 is that public speaking is circular. You have a speaker who gives a message, and then oftentimes that's basically where the speaker thinks their job is done, but it's only just begun, because at that point the message is consumed by the audience. And a good public speaker is going to be able to evaluate the audience, because the audience is giving feedback, whether they're giving it in a very overt way, perhaps by raising their hands or asking a question, but it could be also in a very subtle way. It could be through body language, for instance. And then a good public speaker, within reason, makes adaptations accordingly based on the feedback that they're getting from their audience. And I know that there's only so many adaptations that one could make within the context of the speech, but the ability to be able to read your audience in the moment and to make slight adjustments is really the best way you can go about speaking in front of the public. So this is a kind of circular thing. It's not just necessarily a speaker that is presenting a message to an audience and that it ends there. Chapter 2 talks about getting started, which is exactly where we are as a class, and that we are getting started specifically for our autobiographical speech number 1, that's going to be delivered on the 4th of August, which happens to be a Tuesday, either through Zoom, if you choose that, or that you would upload your speech if you choose that option. And in terms of the autobiographical speech, you're going to be asked to give a 5-minute autobiographical speech that tells the audience something about you and your life. Again, all of this is in the notes posted for today. Some of you might decide to do a life overview, where you're basically giving an overview of the major elements of your life. Obviously, you have to pick and choose because you've got only 5 minutes. Perhaps you want to focus on a particular area, something like a hobby or an interest of yours, and telling us about how that hobby or interest helps us understand who you are as a person. Remember, it's not an informative speech about that hobby or interest. Though many times what students do is that what they talk about in their first speech, they use as a springboard for their second informative speech, and even for their third speech, their persuasive speech, which is definitely an option, but not a requirement. If somebody doesn't feel very comfortable self-disclosing about themselves or isn't quite sure what to talk about in an autobiographical speech, I often recommend education. That's the one thing that we all share, whether it's something like you're talking about an educational goal you have, or what your educational history was, or why it is that you're taking this particular class in this particular moment. So it's the one thing that we all share, and again, you don't necessarily have to be very open about elements of your life that might feel uncomfortable to you. That said, I'm going to be posting some sample speeches of students, not in any way affiliated with GCC, but these are students delivering autobiographical speeches so that you can see for yourselves some of the ways that they've proceeded, and we can talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of those particular speeches. So these are speeches either that were uploaded to YouTube or that were contracted through a textbook company so that they could be examined by public speaking classes like our own. And it allows us to not only see some models, but also to be hypercritical in a way we wouldn't necessarily be of ourselves, because we can fast forward and we can rewind and we can review over and over again. The idea behind the speech is that ultimately it occurs in the moment, not that you're reviewing it over and over. So, in terms of getting started for that autobiographical speech, the second chapter presents a visual that looks much like a staircase in terms of the 7 steps that you need to think about it in relation to preparing for and ultimately presenting a speech. And right now we're all at about number 1. We're selecting and narrowing the topic. So you know the general topic or theme is an autobiographical speech about yourself. But now you're trying to determine the specifics of what it is that you want to say about yourself. Number 2, you're determining the purpose of that particular speech. And again, as I had indicated earlier, while for you the purpose might be to earn a good grade or satisfy a requirement, for me the purpose happens to be that you get to practice some of the skills the textbook and the video and I have talked about, and also that we get to know each other a little bit better as a class. 3, analyzing audience and occasion. And we adapt based on who our audience happens to be, and we also adapt based on the occasion. I think I might have mentioned this in an earlier video, that we tend to present ourselves differently at, let's say, a social function than we might at a work function. The way we dress, the vocabulary we use, the topics of conversation. And it would be the same with delivering a speech. And I'm very fond of what I call the school of you can't make these things up, that oftentimes real life is a lot more interesting than any example you could be given in a textbook. So I'll share a story with you in the you can't make these things up vein. And this happened to a colleague of mine at another college, and I won't say where, but basically this was a colleague who was teaching public speaking. And the speech that the student was delivering was a very philosophical speech. It was about being and remaining true to oneself. And over the course of the speech, the student began to remove clothing. And at first it was as simple as removing something like a watch band or a hat. But eventually the student started to unbuckle his pants, and the teacher stopped the speech right there and then and asked the student what exactly was going on. And the student said, well, I want to be true to myself, and I want to show all of you the true me. In other words, the student had intended on disrobing. Needless to say, that did not go well in this particular class. And might I say is that the student didn't consider point number 3, analyzing the audience and the occasion. That this was not an appropriate audience for which to disrobe, and this was not an appropriate occasion which to disrobe. And I like to say somewhat facetiously that if you learn nothing else in my class, you learn that you will not disrobe during your speech. But that story, I think, really illustrates how it's possible that someone really doesn't think about audience and occasion. Number 4, gathering material, which we'll talk about much more in depth. The first speech, certainly, if you felt you wanted to interview family members about your family history, if you felt that this would be an opportunity to learn about your family background by looking through your Ellis Island records, you could do that if you so wanted, but I certainly don't require or expect that. That basically you have a sense already right now, and based on what you've lived in your life, as to how you could go about incorporating that into a speech. And we'll spend some time also talking about the specifics of how to do that, and I'll also be available to give you feedback as well. Making a speaking outline is number 5. I would argue perhaps one of the most important elements in delivering a speech, and there's an entire chapter that's devoted to that. And I can tell you right now that you are going to be reading the textbook, and they're going to be giving you examples of outlines that are much too detailed, I think, as speaking outlines. Those outlines work well for you as a reader if you're reading the textbook, so you can get a sense as to what the speech was about, but that ultimately your outlines will be much more simplistic. Key words and phrases just to kind of remind you of main points. And I think I might have already made this analogy of likening it to the net a trapeze artist would use. And that's what your speaking outline is. It's there in case of an emergency. Does the trapeze artist fall into the net? Probably not. But it's there just in case. And it's the same with your speaking outlines. You need to refer to it? Maybe not, if you're very, very familiar with the material you're presenting. And you are going to be familiar, certainly, with the content in speech number 1, because it's your life, it's your lived experience. But it's there just in case you happen to lose your track of thought. And then finally, practicing and delivering the speech itself. So that's what chapter 2 was about. So what I encourage you to do now is sort of think about what it is you think you might want to share in an autobiographical speech. That said, for those of you who like to think ahead, you might want to anticipate what you might want to talk about in an informative and persuasive speech, but one speech at a time. Right now we're focusing on speech number 1. And then the third chapter that I had assigned for today is critical listening. The idea that not only will we be presenting speeches, but we will be listening to the speeches of our classmates as well as listening to practice speeches. And that there is a difference between hearing, which is just processing sound, and listening, which is paying attention. And definitely what we want to focus on is the idea of listening and paying attention. And some of the reasons why people don't pay attention. And again, we're presented with terms that you might be familiar with under other labels. Daydreaming, in other words, drifting thoughts, is known as the internal perceptual field. In that other words, we basically become distracted because of our internal perceptual field or our thoughts, our daydreaming. And it's a very common thing to do, in part because we think much more quickly than anybody can speak. So basically our mind begins to drift and makes associations with one thing after another, and before we know it, we've lost a particular moment in time of content. And if you've ever had the experience of driving and getting to a location and not necessarily remembering how you got there, then that also is something that you could use as a kind of connection with what happens with our internal perceptual field when we're not necessarily paying attention. It's one of the reasons why schools emphasize note-taking. The act of taking notes is going to hopefully force you to pay attention in that particular moment. Then there is the external perceptual field. If internal is internal, our minds, external is outward, outside of our minds, our environment. Things like temperature and lighting and noise influence how we receive a speech and how we deliver a speech as well. And sometimes we can manipulate those external variables and sometimes we can't. In the new normal we live in now, it's definitely an additional challenge. I don't know if you heard earlier or not, my dog come in and out of the room. Definitely that was something that caught my attention. I don't know if it caught yours or not, but it's something that I wouldn't necessarily have as a challenge if I were delivering in a classroom. But I do have as a challenge here when I'm delivering in my living room, which is what this is, my living room. So at any rate, thinking about what to consider when you are listening to speeches. And while the textbook gives you a good number of questions to consider, you'll see that what I've also posted on our Moodle site under syllabus and other documents is an attachment about a speech rating handout. And in fact, I'm going to use that very handout or that very speech rating piece for evaluating your first speech. And you can see that the handout goes through multiple things to consider in terms of content and also in terms of delivery, with a ranking from excellent to a non-existent. And I'll just use that for the first speech and write a few comments of my own and then send that to you via email after your speech is over with your letter grade. I don't even bother to use that template for the second or the third speech. I just take notes about things that occur to me. But we can see that in that particular handout, which we will review more in depth in future classes, those are basically all of the pieces that the Toastmaster video talked about, and those are basically all of the pieces that the text will be examining and that I will be discussing as well. And if you're having difficulty opening those particular attachments for the syllabus, the course outline, and the speech rating, I've also put that in the body of that particular section as well, so that you don't necessarily need to read the attachment to see the information. But if it turns out that you needed me to send you an attachment via email, please let me know and I'll be happy to do that. So I think that basically covers the major elements for the first three chapters that we have assigned. Next class, you can see that on our course outline, I've assigned 3 other chapters that I thought would be useful in terms of organizing and outlining your speech, which is chapter 7, at least in the edition of the text that I'm using. Beginning and ending your speech, which is chapter 8. And then lastly, chapter 9, wording your speech. So we'll talk about those 3 chapters, as well as talking a little bit about a speaking outline for the first speech. Eventually, there will be a quiz on some of these chapters, and that quiz I will be posting online. And Normally, it would be a closed book exam, but considering the situation that we're in now, I'm not against your using your book to find the answers to these particular quiz questions. So you can think of it as an open book exam if you so wanted to. Because I'm hopeful that the questions that I'm asking aren't just necessarily testing if you're familiar with the material, but also these are questions that will help you understand what you should be focusing on when you are putting together your own speech, which is the whole point of this class, is basically the delivery of the speeches themselves. And you can see that all of this is leading up to the 4th of August, where we have our autobiographical speech. So in terms of where we are, if you've got questions or concerns, please let me know, and I will be happy to answer them. And I'm well. I hope you're well. And next class we will continue on. And at this point, think a little bit about how you might like to proceed with that autobiographical speech. And for your attendance today on the discussion forum, to please share some techniques or ideas that you have about ways for controlling nerves. Take care. Bye-bye.